What is that? What are you guys doing right now?
Okay. Environmental racism is the topic of my presentation. So, let's first start by defining environmental racism, which is it's basically just discrimination that's based on the environmental conditions where people live. So, basically, people of minority groups being forced to live in areas that have higher levels of pollution and different, high levels of pollution, basically. One of the major parts of pollution in general, and also related specifically to this issue, is particulate matter. So this is basically just stuff that comes out of like smokestacks and cars and stuff. It's just like particles. It's a very broad category of pollution, but includes just like particles in the air. And in general, black people are exposed to 1.5 times more of it than white people are. Hispanics are 1.2 times more, and poor people are 1.3 times exposed to. People below the poverty line are exposed to 1.3 times more particulate matter than people above the poverty line. So what's interesting about this is that I think a general explanation that a lot of people would use to maybe not associate environmental racism with race is saying like, well, poor people are going to live in communities that have more pollution, and black people are more likely to be poor because of we learned about this in the redlining presentation that there's a lot of systematic discrimination, also just leftover effects from the past that make African Americans and other minority groups less likely to have money. But you can see that poor people are exposed to 1.3 times more than people above the poverty line, but black people are exposed to 1.5 times more. So you can't explain all of this, all of the difference by income. You actually race has to account for some of it, too, which is interesting. And also just a few things. Particulate matter is linked to a lot of different diseases.
You say race has to account for some of it. It's not here, like, it's not like assigned housing, like, based on your race. So now, like, you, like...
Yeah, but, like, from the redlining thing.
That's true, it's not, but you can, if it was an equal distribution of, if people could choose to live wherever they want, and unless black people wanted to live more in communities that had higher levels of pollution, you would expect to see an even distribution, right? Like, unless there was some mental difference. But of course, you are right that there isn't necessarily laws anymore that specifically say you have to live here, but there's more systematic things that make it more likely that minorities are going to live in certain areas, which we can go into in a little bit. So one of the main contributors to this is an idea called eminent domain. So this is basically the ability for the government to take land away, privately owned land, for public use. So I guess a lot of good examples would be like, oh, we need to build a school or a park. We might need to take some people's land away to use this. And yeah, so this is addressed in the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, which states that nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So you can say that there are two requirements to using eminent domain as outlined by the Fifth Amendment. One, there must be just compensation. So the government has to pay people back for how much equivalent to the value of the land that they took. And this is usually determined basically just by property value, in the similar way that we would evaluate properties to find property taxes. And the other requirement is that it must be for public use. So, a congressman can't just say, I want your land, I'm going to take it and live on it, build my house there. It has to be for the use of the public. And this is where it gets kind of more contentious. So this relates to a Supreme Court case called Berman versus Parker. So this is where in Washington, D.C., there was a lot of neighborhoods that were termed blighted. So, but that basically just means they've fallen into disrepair. We've learned a lot about this in this class of different neighborhoods. Just the living conditions can fall, and a lot of the services and buildings just fall into disrepair, and yeah, it becomes not a great place to live. And these were called blighted neighborhoods. So the plan of Washington, D.C., the city, their plan was to clean up these neighborhoods by using eminent domain to acquire huge amounts of property, these neighborhoods, and then giving that property to a private developer. So one person objected to this who was owned a department store and said, no, you can't. This isn't covered under the Fifth Amendment. Their main objection claim was, if you're giving this land to a private developer, that's not public use anymore, because you're not building something that everyone's going to use. Like if you were building a park, then everyone can go to the park and use it. But if you're giving it to someone who's going to just turn it into a bunch of houses, then that's not for everyone. It's a private company. It's also allowing the private company to make money off of this. So what ultimately ended up happening is that he lost this case, and this granted the ability for the government to take land for public, to use eminent domain to take land and give it to private companies. And there are, the critics of this decision, are saying that it's basically expanded the definition beyond the Constitution to say, the land doesn't just have to be for public use, it can be for what's called public purpose. So this basically means, like, even if the public isn't going to be using the land, as long as the government has a purpose in mind that's supposed to help the public, like cleaning up a neighborhood that might not be a great place to live, if the government has a plan like that in mind, they can take the land and give it to a private company, and it doesn't have to go to the public. And basically, after this decision, the use of eminent domain increased a lot. There were a lot more local governments started using it because they could use it for more broader purposes. And a lot of people a lot of critics of this would call that maybe abuse of eminent domain. And so it does kind of relate to racism in that part of it is that these neighborhoods that were called blighted neighborhoods were obviously predominantly minority neighborhoods. And so you have predominantly minority people who are having their lands taken by the government and given to someone else. And the end result of what these campaigns were called urban renewal campaigns to try and, I think it's a noble goal, it's something we've talked about in this class, of trying to revitalize neighborhoods that aren't great places to live in. But the end result of it was that a huge number of African Americans and other minority groups ended up losing their homes, and there's not a lot of ability to fight eminent domain. I mean, you can get into a legal battle like that department store owner did, but obviously a lot of people, that a department store owner is a pretty wealthy person. Most people who are living in maybe poor neighborhoods won't be able to afford that, won't be able to fight back if they don't want to give their land to eminent domain. And so this ended up just kicking a lot of African Americans out of cities. Another way this kind of relates to race is that eminent domain is also used to take property from minority neighborhoods and sometimes build different industrial things on it, so that might contribute to pollution, especially because this is allowing the government to give it to use eminent domain and give the land to a private company. So there's been cases where land has been given to manufacturing places, which can contribute to pollution in the area. And minority neighbors are generally just less able to fight against this. So if a company wants to build a big industrial place, then they're gonna go for the path of least resistance, and that's generally in minority neighborhoods. Like if they say, "Oh, I'm gonna do a thing that's contentious and controversial in a wealthier white neighborhood that might have more power," you're more likely to get denied than if you do it in a neighborhood that is poor and has people who are more disenfranchised. So, yeah, this is one of these things about this kind of racism, that it ends up not being like one person who just hates minorities, who just wants to make their life worse, but it's just systematic and structural components of how our society works that result in groups getting discriminated against. Moving on, Superfund sites. So Superfund sites are places that have been designated by the EPA as being so toxic that they're a danger to public health. And there's a fund that's put together that's for the EPA to clean up these places. So just places that might have elevated levels of dangerous chemicals or have been used in the past for manufacturing radioactive things that can be dangerous. And there's actually a Superfund site near us, which is in Hunters Point Shipyard. So this place, Hunter's Point and also Treasure Island, which is in the article you read, we'll touch on it a little bit. They were both used. To clean off ships that had been involved in nuclear testing. So in the Pacific around World War II, we were doing a lot of tests of nuclear. And after World War II, we were doing tests of nuclear weapons, and these ships would come back with radioactivity on them. And Hunter's Point Shipyard and also Treasure Island were used to clean them up. This did end up leaving a good amount of radiation just in the soil and in the area there. And Hunter's Point is now a Superfund site. It's also a planned development that there's a development plan that will build 12,100 homes on Hunter's Point Shipyard. And there's the cleanup is in progress, but there's been a lot of allegations of fraud against the company that's been cleaning it up. And there's a campaign to get a lot of samples retested now. And it is hard to kind of figure out what the state of that is with an ongoing investigation, but it seems like it's not completely cleaned up and there might be some risk for people who are living there. But this also just kind of touched on the other issue of like the community activists in the Hunter's Point neighborhood aren't totally against this development or aren't completely opposed to it, just because it would bring a lot of homes for people who don't have access to housing, and a lot of people think that it would help revitalize that neighborhood in that it would attract businesses and help improve the economy. So it's the people of this neighborhood Hunter's Point aren't really like up in arms against this too much, but it is still, I think, a concerning fact that we're building on affordable housing on a potentially radioactive place. And another, I think, what is even more concerning is what's happening with Treasure Island. I don't know if you've been to Treasure Island, but there are these signs in a few places that say restricted area, radioactive, and they're just posted on like fences and stuff. And recently, Hunter's Point was also involved with the same cleanup, and the Navy's been cleaning it up for a long time. But there has been recently there's been some more evidence of specific areas that have a lot more radiation than we thought. And these right here you can see are areas that are just new sites that we didn't know were radioactive that the Navy just recently through a survey found out about. And this is also a lot of development that's happening. So if you can see here, this gray area this is going to be planned development, and this is going to be planned open space. So you can see it does overlap with radioactive areas, and so hopefully the Navy's planning on cleaning up this whole site and then selling it to the city once it's completely clean. And this is another thing of like it's very hard to get to the truth of the issue sometimes. Of like there's been a lot of accusations against the Navy that maybe they aren't actually being as thorough cleaning it up as well as they could. And there's been some experts who have been pretty concerned about this. But the Navy does say that it should be completely safe. So it might be. It's hard for me to know as a person who's not like an expert on radioactivity or has never tested the island. It's hard for me to draw from conclusion, but there is a lot of people who are really concerned about this being dangerous. And there are already a lot of people who are living on Treasure Island. A lot of it is used for affordable housing. And in fact, a third of the population of Treasure Island is formerly homeless. So you do have to weigh. I think there is some kind of. Obviously, we don't want to be putting people in areas where it's dangerous to live. But if we are trying to increase the amount of housing, then we might want to consider different options. I don't know if it's true that this is the only place that we could have made houses for formerly homeless people, but there is currently the development that would happen there would be subsidized by the city to make it more affordable, but it's still pretty concerning. I think it's personally pretty concerning that it could be on a radioactive area, and there is some experts who work there who said that maybe it won't be completely safe for a very, very long time. So basically this is kind of one of the forms of environmental racism that's closer to it's closer to where we live. So it kind of makes it, at least for me, because like I've been to Treasure Island a few times, it makes it so that it's less abstract and yeah. But overall, recently there was a big report published by the EPA just across the whole country that showed that African Americans were much more likely to both live near factories and power plants, and also that they were more likely to be exposed to pollutants independent of of their increased risk of living near these power plants. So basically, what that means is that they're not just more likely to live near industrial places, but the industrial places that they're likely to live next to are putting out more pollutants than average. So that might indicate that there's just less regulations in areas that have a higher minority population. There's also been African Americans have have around 7 times a higher rate of asthma than the general population. So and this is one of the main proposed theories for why that's true, because there doesn't seem to be like any kind of genetic thing. There might be some other factors, but it seems like this is one of the main contributors to this. So basically, environmental racism is one of the forms of racism that kind of lingers in our society even after we might have gotten rid of more overt racism. There's still discrepancies that can't be fully explained by chance or just income of our society. Questions?
Questions? Thank you. That's excellent.
I just want to point out a little bit of information literacy. Any observations of that map?
This is from the Navy.
Is it from the Navy?
Yeah.
Oh, is that what you're talking about?
The source of the information is from the Navy, but who made the...
What this? I got the map from a news source, but their source was the Navy.
Okay. The color scheme is definitely not unbiased.
You're right. Yes, you're right.
Like,
and it doesn't.
Bright green and yellow, glowing out of the boundaries. It makes it look scary. It is scary,
Yes.
but
You're
it
right.
emphasizes
of course,
that.
I think that I would agree that there is maybe an outside, in general, there might be an outsized fear of radiation in general in the public. Like, people like talk about like, oh, your cell phone emits radiation, is it going to give you cancer? Where it's like it's not actually dangerous. But this is radiation that came from nuclear weapons, which makes it a little more concerning. But honestly, I don't really understand radiation that well, so yeah, it's hard for me to actually come to a firm conclusion on this, whether or not this is a safe thing.
Thank you. Mr. Fisher.
Mr. President, I have to leave at 2:15. Should I?
Yeah.